Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We? A series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. Your host for this program is Deborah Ross. In this series, Deb takes us to locations that inform us about the history of our community. She also visits with local historians. We welcome your feedback and suggestions.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Now Where Were We? An ongoing series featuring the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. My name is Deborah Ross, and today I'm very pleased and privileged to have with me John Hough, a maritime historian and past president of the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society. John is the co-author with Les Eldridge of a book about our maritime history called Maritime History of Olympia and South Puget Sound, to be published in April of 2017 by Arcadia Press. Thank you so much for coming out on this blustery day, John.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Deborah. Standing here on the waterfront, it's pretty quiet today, but about 120 years ago, this was a beehive of activity by steamers. There were so many of them around Puget Sound, they called it the Mosquito Fleet. And these steamers would take passengers and freight at many stops around Puget Sound, kind of like a bus route today. And they served Olympia as well as a number of other communities. One of the more famous ones was the Saul G. Simpson that ran from Shelton, many stops along the way to Olympia and back. In those days, because there weren't many roads, and the ones that were muddy and not passable most of the year, people went by boat. And a lot of times passengers picked the boat by who the captain was. They had favorite captains, kind of like if you checked out who the pilot was on an airliner before getting aboard. But one of the fun scenes must have been they raced a lot each other, not only for bragging rights, but oftentimes the fastest boat could demand the highest rates. And so you could see two boats steaming along, black smoke pouring out their funnels, and the passengers would line the rails and yell insults at each other. And if there was fruit on board, throw apples or pears at one another, having a great time. So the Mosquito Fleet was the primary means of transportation for many decades. But after World War I, when they started building better roads and they started running buses between the major towns and cities, the Mosquito Fleet gradually faded away.
So basically what you're telling me is this was kind of like the I-5 back in the late 19th century for Olympia.
It was. The harbor was crowded with boats going back and forth, and that's why they called it the Mosquito Fleet. They were everywhere.
Can you tell me a little bit about where we're standing today?
Yes, we're standing on today's modern Percival Landing in downtown Olympia, but it's the site of the old Percival dock that was built by Sam Percival to service the Mosquito Fleet boats. He would sell tickets to passengers. He would handle freight on and off the boats. This was a busy place back in those days, and he and his son John were in business for a number of decades until finally the Mosquito Fleet faded away.
Now, I've seen a couple of photographs of John Percival and the ticket office, and it looks like you might have been able to get a ticket as far as Alaska.
Oh, yes. Basically, the boats that ran into here would go up to Tacoma, where passengers could catch ocean-going ships up to Alaska, but also down to San Francisco. So this was kind of a transit spot. People would come up from the Chehalis Valley or whatever, catch the boat up to Tacoma, and then change onto another boat if they were going to Alaska or San Francisco.
Well, thanks for telling me about the Mosquito Fleet and passenger traffic. We're going to talk a little bit now about other forms of maritime traffic, which was the sand and gravel industry. So, John, the sun has come out just in time for us to pay a visit to the historic Sandman vessel. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Sure, Deborah. This is a real piece of Olympia history. When Arthur Weston established his Olympia Sand and Gravel Company, he needed a tug to pull the barges loaded with sand and gravel from the big gravel pit just north of Stellicum that's now Chambers Bay Golf Course. But you can still see the remnants of the gravel operation there. Olympia was booming. It was being built. There were new buildings being built on the Capitol campus, and Weston saw the need for gravel and sand. So he commissioned the Sandman to be built by the Crawford and Reed shipyard in Tacoma, and they were famous for building some of the fastest Mosquito Fleet boats. And so the Sandman was launched in 1910, so she's been around a long time. Kind of an interesting sidelight is while she was being built, the Alaska Pacific Yukon exposition was going on, and Weston was wandering through the machinery hall and saw a brand new maritime engine called the Frisco Standard and ordered it on the spot. And so when the exposition was over with, they shipped it down to Tacoma and installed it in the Sandman. She's had several new engines since then, but when she was launched in 1910, she was state of the art. So for many decades, Sandman hauled sand and gravel down to Olympia. She hauled log rafts, barges full of goods and things. And Weston eventually sold her. She went through several ownerships over the years. Franz Schlottmann was the last owner who actually used her as a workhorse. And then a nonprofit organization bought her and has preserved her ever since down here on the Olympia waterfront. So if you see the Sandman, she's a real piece of history.
And I imagine that some people watching this episode aren't aware of the origin of the name Sandman for this boat.
Well, he didn't come up with something real clever. She was hauling sand, so she was called the Sandman.
And is it open to the public to visit?
Yes, the nonprofit that runs her opens her on the weekends and during the festivals for the public, and they're very proud of her.
So a real piece of Olympia maritime history is still down here on the water.
Certainly. She goes back over 100 years, and so she's a real piece of Olympia history.
Well, again, John, thank you so much for taking time out, and thanks for bringing the nice weather to us today, and letting us learn a little bit about the history of maritime traffic in early Olympia and South Puget Sound. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Deborah. My pleasure.